So, MasterCard, you're a technology-intensive company in the services sector. Do you share the optimism that was expressed by our co-editors about the future innovation landscape, and what are your concerns in this regard?
It's a fantastic, does this work? Yes, it's a fantastic question for an innovation optimist. If I take a look at our industry, in case you're wondering what MasterCard does, we do not issue credit cards. There will be no forms at the exit. We are, in effect, a payment technology company. We're in the broader space of financial services. We are a network that facilitates payments. When I look at what happened the last 5 years in our industry, probably more change than we've seen in the last 50 years before. And you look at the kind of change, new business models, new entrants, whole new markets unlocked, so a lot of positive change. And if I look at the common driver from my vantage point across the board, it's really the change in innovation. The change in technology. So the change in technology is really changing what is possible in our industry. And why is this exciting? Why is it positive for us is, when you look at it, what technology allows us to do, new technology, digital technology, as Daniel was talking about earlier, it allows us to serve our customers much better, so that helps. It certainly changes the way we work in a more efficient and effective manner. And finally, it really helps us to address issues that otherwise would have not been possible to address as they go beyond an individual company. Topics like inclusive growth, topics like financial inclusion, and the likes. Just to explore a couple of these aspects. Serving our customers better. It sounds like the most obvious thing to say, but there would be never a good panel if you don't talk about the Internet of Things. So let me just get it out of the way right now and talk about the Internet of Things. 2025, 70 billion connected devices. Customer expectations are changing. Everybody wants to get up in the morning and do something, and that something doesn't generally include they want to pay. So you want to pay in the context of whatever you're trying to do. Buy a good, buy a service, do something. It has to be contextual, and it's generally channel independent. You're not thinking about a piece of plastic in your hand or your mobile or whatever it is. The vision that we have that these 70 billion connected devices are going to be commerce devices at some point in time. 5 years ago, we would have had no way to enable that kind of environment. Today, we have the technology to do that. That's completely changing the playing field for us as a company, for us as an industry, for banks and so forth. And payments are the fuel of the economies around the world. So if I think innovation index somewhere, there should be a pillar about payments, and new technology gets me very excited along those lines. The ways we work, oftentimes innovation is thought about as like the bright shiny object. It is that cool app or whatever it might be, but a lot of innovation is often found in supply chains and in value chains and in ecosystems. They unlock a lot of value at a multiplier effect. So I'm excited about that. If you are, I'm thinking about the Brazilian industry here. So the Brazilian industry trying to make cross-border payments as they're importing stuff. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do today. It is an ecosystem that has been stagnant for 50 years. Technology is there today. And here's the second buzzword that has to be on every panel, blockchain. Blockchain is the answer to make cross-border payments much more efficient. So yet again, many reasons to be excited. And, sorry, one last comment. On the inclusive growth part, bigger problems, what the innovation index is really going after when you look at it from a country perspective. Financial inclusion, pulling people into the financial mainstream. Just think about it, all these 70 billion connected devices. If you don't have a financial identity, you're not going to be on the net. There is the technology today to do that, and do that in a cost-effective manner and make it interesting for us, banks and other players. Yet again, a reason to be very excited about.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. Now, if I'm not mistaken, your largest pool of employees outside of the United States of America is located in India. And a number of technology roles are performed, I think, in India for MasterCard. Now, we've seen China rise rather spectacularly in the rankings of the GII. India is moving and has moved significantly in the last couple of years, but it's in a different place. It's, if I'm not mistaken, number 57 this year. How is your view of the innovation potential in India, the state of innovation in India?
Yeah, so as a US company, having our largest employee base other than our home market in India tells you a lot to start with. Now, I want to just spend a minute on China, though. We do invest in China, and China is a hugely important market. But you know, when you look at what India has done differently than China, you start to see a couple of differences if you explore that. And one of them is the focus on exactly what I was saying earlier, underlying ecosystems, underlying infrastructure. So the Indian government has set out to create a common payment infrastructure. And that has done is it built a huge fintech investment sector and a whole startup community in India that is using that central infrastructure to drive growth. That's very different than in China, where it's very sector-oriented and it's very state-driven, so a very different approach. Since China is going in that direction, we're an active participant as an investor. We're putting our research centers out there. We are taking all that input from that startup scene. We see India is on a very, very encouraging path. Interestingly enough, we're starting to see a lot of our Indian talent actually land up in other markets around the world. So it's a source of innovation, it's a source of ideas way beyond India itself.
Yeah. And perhaps one final for the moment question to you. We'll come back later. Like most large multinational corporations, you're very clearly focused on trade policy, and trade policy is extremely important to you. Now, I believe your CEO, the CEO of MasterCard, is a member of the US Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. How do you see the current wave of trade tensions, and how do you see it evolving, and its impact on innovation?
It's a fantastic question. We are on the record, so... First of all, I could give you the whole German-European version of this, but I won't. I give you the MasterCard global version of the answer. And that is, it's really very difficult to predict. So you have a whole range of countries affected by recent introductions of tariffs. If there is, there could be so many scenarios coming out of that. It could be a full-blown trade war. It could be stalemates. It could be anything. The one thing that is, I think, relatively straightforward to predict is that it will lead to a lack of certainty. So compared to what we had maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, where there was a much clearer outlook on the global economy, that lack of certainty is there today. That will translate, certainly in my view, into a loss of confidence in business. You will see investment decisions being delayed. If you have the choice today to put a factory or a distribution center in market A or B, you don't really know how the tariff situation is going to play out, you're going to halt that investment decision for sure. One thing that we see happening short-term, regardless of all of that, is people need to react short-term today already, and that is a function of the closely interlinked global supply chains. So if you are affected by any one of these tariffs, you need to make a decision today. So we will see some action. Despite the lack of certainty, people will make short-term reactions and say, I'm going to now start to deploy my distribution in a different way than I had before. So unclear to say where it's going to go. But supply chain will drive something that might actually feed right back into how this whole game of trade policy is being played as people start to see global companies reacting.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. So now, Ambassador Rugwabiza, we turn to you, Valentine, please. Rwanda has been a leader in innovation on the African continent. And you've had a number of successes, and you have been operating in a way, in a resource-constrained environment. How do you see the future? Are you optimistic about the future innovation landscape for Rwanda, first of all, for the African continent, and what are your concerns in this regard?
Thank you very much, Francis. Really, this is an incredible campus, Cornell Tech. So I want to say how pleased I am to be here. This is the first time I'm coming to the campus, so it's so beautiful and really modern. I will also say that I think one clear output, before I get to your question, one clear output of this GII 2018 is really to get Francis to New York. It's very, very difficult to get him in New York. So it has been years since he last visited New York. So that is a clear output of this year GII. As to your question, it's clear that Rwanda has been a success. I think the question, the message to get out of that is that while there is a clear correlation between the level of income and the innovation, there is a very clear correlation, as we have seen. There is no level of income, a threshold at which innovation can happen. So I think that is the optimistic and positive message to get out of our experience in Rwanda. We have embraced innovation. How did it come about? First of all, the type of challenges we were confronted with were not possible to address without embracing innovation. However, innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we really had to put in place the ecosystem. And hence why this will explain, in a way, the kind of gap you see, including for Rwanda, between the input and the output. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to put in place to build the infrastructure. You need to put in place the institutions. You need to put in place really the conducive business environment. And we have been focusing on all that. We have seen some of the outputs clearly, not sufficiently, but again, it is a journey. And again, as was mentioned by one of the speakers, innovation is not only a result of sciences. There are sciences, but they have to be competitive processes. And then the human dimension, the human capital. And in terms of the human capital and dimension, it takes time. It takes time to build the type of STEM resources that you need to really be able to translate your initial input into output. So that, I would like to leave you with at least that positive message when it comes to Rwanda. We are among the countries that are among the innovation countries, despite belonging to the segment of low-income country. So it is possible. It is possible with leadership, with the conducive environment in place, with really the ecosystem. And one has to invest into that ecosystem. Just to give you some of the innovations that have been happening in Rwanda, in the energy sector, since really this year GII is focused on energy. In the energy sector, for the first time in the world, it is in Rwanda that it was possible to separate the gas methane from, we have a lot of gas methane in the Lake Kivu. For the first time, it was possible to separate the gas methane from water and produce energy, electricity out of it. By doing that, not only we were adding to our energy mix, but at the same time, we were solving an environment issue. Having such a huge amount of stock of methane in the lake was hazardous and was really dangerous for the environment and all people living around Lake Kivu. So this is just to give you some of the examples. But at the same time, as I said, you have to focus on the resources, on building the human capital that is needed for that.
Great, thank you very much. So long-term game, building the infrastructure, the human resources. You've given us one good example of innovation in Rwanda. I think you've been using drone delivery mechanisms, have you not, in agriculture?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, partnerships have a key role to play into that. The energy example that I gave you, but drones, we've been using drones. And in that, we entered into a partnership with a company from the West Coast, Zipline. Clearly, they had been able to develop drones and we were able to use those drones for our own health goals by making sure we use today the drone to access and to provide the blood in regions that are not accessible, that will not be easily accessible to groups, to patients, that will not be easily accessible. And that has made a turnaround. We were able to measure the impact in terms of just reducing our mortality, mainly mortality coming from, let's say, car accidents or natural disasters. We were able, using the drones that were put in place. Now, one may ask, why wasn't it used elsewhere? Well, the company that produced these drones, that had put together this drone zipline, they had approached a number of countries before, but what they found in Rwanda was that openness to innovation and attachment to making sure that innovation is part of our solutions mixed to all our development challenges. So you need also that openness to innovation to really to have innovation being able to strive and to serve development purposes and economic growth.
Great, thank you very much. Just one quick word, the African continent. So Rwanda, a shining example. There are other great examples. How is your view about Africa as a whole? Are we going to expect to see, in the course of the 21st century, some of the rising development that we've witnessed in Asia in the course of the last part of the 21st, the 2000s, the 1900s and the 2000s?
It is actually happening, Francis. I think we need to look more closely at what's happening on the African continent. In addition to what I've mentioned regarding Rwanda, I can see the ambassador of Morocco is here. Morocco is a leader when it comes to wind energy, to the production of wind energy, and it has been a leader for a while. And the production of wind energy in Morocco is really very competitive. It's very competitive, and it's a large part of their energy mix. So innovation has been happening, and I think the key element here is to say it's this, regardless of the disparities that are there, to understand that, well, what is the future in terms of the African continent? Well, the future, I will say, is bright. And why? Because first of all, we are in a process of creating the critical mass, removing the existing barriers between African countries. Earlier this year, in March, just the continent decided to create the largest continental free trade agreement. Out of the 54 African countries, 49 have signed that continental free trade agreement. Now, this is happening at the time when, in the rest of the world, quite honestly, when it comes to trade, borders are rather closing, if anything, or being a little bit more restrictive. So we are optimistic about that, but also the age group of the African population. The age group of the African population is an age group that is much more open to embracing innovation. Again, we need to invest in that age group and make sure that it is that demographic dividend is really made to be a demographic dividend. And that will not happen without investing the type of education, having the education system that we need to have in place.
Great. Thank you very much, Valentine. Pedro Wongtschowski, if I may turn to you, in a different continent, Latin America. So you've been closely associated with innovation in Brazil in particular. For Latin America, in the current context, what role do you see innovation playing to ensure a very bright future for the region?
Okay, thank you. It's nice to be here today. I think the main issue in Brazil in particular, but also generally speaking Latin America, is the issue of productivity. Productivity tends to be low, and even during times in which the economy is growing, productivity in most cases and in most countries is not growing at the same pace. There are some exceptions, nevertheless. Probably one very important exception is the agricultural sector in Brazil. agriculture productivity has grown around 3% in the last 25 years, a year in the last 25 years. And that has transformed Brazil into the agricultural powerhouse, the world's probably largest, surpassing in some sectors even the US, one of the world's largest agricultural powerhouses. And productivity in the agricultural sector comes basically from genetics and from industry. Industry, most people don't recognize that there's no modern agriculture without industry. And when I say industry, I mean fertilizer, chemicals, sensors, drones, irrigation systems, machinery. All these, together with genetics, have dramatically changed the situation of the Brazilian agricultural sector. And bringing together with it also a large food industry, which is transforming, starting at least to transform part of these local produced agricultural products into food products and adding value to the Brazilian exports. So I think innovation is key in general for increase of productivity in all the Latin American countries. And with the start now of the issue of the 4.0 industry, this will be obviously even more important in the future.
Thank you very much. Now you are a member of the GII Advisory Board. Thank you very much for all of your services in this regard. But you're also closely associated with advising the Brazilian government, and in particular the transition that the whole world is watching and participating in to some extent to the cyber physical world, Industry 4.0. You've just mentioned it. Can you tell us a little about how you use the GII, and is it useful in this in your roles of looking at how Brazil can place itself in Brazilian industry? Gianni has already mentioned some in this regard. Do you have something to add?
Yes, well, definitely, I think to compare yourself with other places, other countries, to understand what makes countries successful is obviously very important. So the GII has been, I would say, essential for the Brazilian industry and the Brazilian government to focus on the right issues, on finding out what are the key weak points of the Brazilian economy and the Brazilian support system for innovation. And therefore, I think, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, both the Brazilian government and the Brazilian industry has used the GII extensively to define precisely what should be done to, at the end of the day, increase productivity and the well-being of the local population.
Great, thank you very much. Now you're a board member of Embraer, and you are chair of the board of Embrapi. These are great successes, and Embraer is, a leading example of an innovative company in a high-tech industry, very research-intensive industry. Can you tell us a little about this example and any lessons from the story of the success of Embraer?
Well, Embraer is a well-known, I think, success story of a middle-income country producing high-tech products. Probably every American that has flown into this place, or at least most of them, have flown on Embraer planes to come to New York. I think this is a very good example that even middle-income countries can develop high-tech local industries. In the beginning, this company had a very strong support from the local government, from the Brazilian government, but it has been an independent and a private company for more than 20 years, and a very successful one. And both in the commercial airplane business, the executive jets, and military planes. So I think it's a success story. It's an export-driven company. Obviously, 80% of the market is outside of the country, It has production facilities all over the world, in the US, in Europe, in Asia. And I think it can inspire both Brazilian and other middle-income countries to establish high-tech local industries. That's possible. You develop local technology, local know-how. You develop high-tech exports for the country. And it's really a terrific example of something of a success story. Regarding Embraer, that's a private organization, not-for-profit private organization, which has been established basically by the Brazilian private industry through CNI, and has the support or the funding from the Brazilian government, but it's managed as a private, not-for-profit organization that has been supporting Brazilian companies to innovate, basically by financing these companies and helping establish a local network of research organizations that are able to supply services and develop products for the local industry. It's again, we have, I think it's a relatively small number. The figures are small for US standards. So we've spent around $250 million US dollars in the last 4 years. But with that, you can support more than 500 projects of 300 different companies and actually bringing new products and services to the market.
Great. Thank you very much, Pedro. Rima Qureshi, Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer of Verizon. So Verizon has been at the heart of the telecommunications developments, revolutions in the course of the last couple of decades, and you have a very rich experience in this, Rima. So what's your view? Telecommunications, of course, has enabled a huge amount of innovation. How is your view of this? Is this going to continue? Telecommunications going to still be at the heart of innovation in the future, and innovation capacity? And anything on 5G in this regard?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. It is a pleasure to be here. I think before I talk about the future, I'd like to step back and talk a little bit about the past. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure, as well as the difficulty at times, to work in the technology sector for the last 30 years. And if we think back to when basically I started working in telecommunications, what technology that we use on a daily basis we didn't even have access to. And what technology basically has enabled, even in the last 10 years. The iPhone basically did not exist about 10 or 11 years ago, and everything else that we take for granted today that we use for technology. When I started working in the telecommunications field about 25 years ago, the big thing that we were doing with telecommunications was making phone calls and talking. What an interesting concept these days. So if you imagine at that point in time when we had probably a few 100 million people that had access to mobile phones, and the great cool thing was your car had this big, heavy device. You actually had to have a car to have the capability to have mobile communications. That's the world that we are coming from. And if you think today to how many people have access to mobile technology and everything that that enables, we are over 7 billion mobile connections globally. That doesn't necessarily mean that 7 billion people have mobile phones. It just means that some of us have more than one mobile connection. So that's the world that we have created in about 25 years. So if we start with that and look forward, what we see is that pace of change and everything that that will enable in terms of innovation will accelerate exponentially. So that brings me to 5G. What is 5G? 5G is the 5th generation of the technology that enables us to do something as basic as walk around and make a phone call. But it will enable everything that Michael described about the connected devices. So 5G, it's not even worthwhile to really even think about how quickly you can download that movie that you're going to watch on the plane home. It's more important to think about everything else that will get connected and all that it will enable. Everything that will benefit from a connection will be connected. And what will that enable in terms of innovation and the capabilities to allow countries to accelerate and to become more innovative. You talked about the example of drones. The connectivity that is required for those drone capabilities, it is not limited to the richer economies or the first world. It is basically available to everyone. And that's the great thing that we are also seeing with the capabilities that we've developed, is that countries skip generations and they go to the latest generation. So what we see is all of the technologies will only enable, and 5G will only enable an acceleration of that innovation and acceleration of the capabilities that technology brings.
Great, thank you very much, Rima. Now, in that big perspective of telecommunications development, of course, the rise of mobile technology has been very important also. How do you see that evolving and its role in relation to innovations also?
I think mobile is going to be key. Mobile is going to be key because of the way that we, of course, are living today, which is very different than the way that we used to live, whether it be how we work. For myself personally, my office is basically wherever I am because I have all of the tools available to me to work. It also changes the way that we socialize. My daughters, sometimes they're in the same house, but I socialize with them by texting them because it's easier somehow to communicate with them that way than to talk to them. So I think it's changing the way that we live, and it is about the capabilities that mobility provides for us as humans to interact with technology. But I think that mobility aspect is also going to be important in all of the other things that will be connected and that will also benefit from that mobility.
Great, and then just the last, if I may, you are, of course, enabling the movement of data everywhere. And we see more and more concern about the issue of trust with all of these data flowing everywhere. Trust, and Michael has referred to one of the possible instruments for the establishment of trust, blockchain, greater trust. How do you see this? The European Union has, of course, introduced the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has everyone on the run, and the notion of citizen ownership of data coming in there. What's your view on how we can enhance trust in this environment, which is moving so quickly and where data is generated by all of our devices and will be, as again Michael has described, with the Internet of Things, be more and more and more data generated? Trust is central. What's your view?
Well, my view is I think it is, of course, the responsibility of the companies such as Verizon that own the data and how we share and use that data. And of course, that is extremely important in everything that we do, and it is extremely important in terms of the trust that the customer has put in us in providing us that information. And we need to be very clear about how we are using that data. And I think that is something, as you hear within the news, that is, of course, up for discussion and regulation across the world today. And I think we will see that to continue. But I think it's also very much about communication and education. All of us as individuals also need to understand what are we signing up for. There is no such thing as a free lunch, maybe except for the lunch we will have later. I think it is about the fact that whenever we share data, we have to really question what is that data being used for. So it is also the responsibility of all of us to understand what data are we providing and what could that data be used for and how could that be monetized. So I think it is all of our responsibilities, and it is also very important for all of us to understand what exactly is important in terms of trust.
Great, thank you very much, Rima. Sweta Govani, you are the Managing Director of the Global Innovation Exchange. at results for development. So the Global Innovation Exchange is a technology platform that aimed at accelerating innovation in emerging markets. Tell us about it.
Sure, happy to. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure. So Global Innovation Exchange is a technology platform and a database that is managed by Results for Development. It's also supported by USAID, DFAC, QUICA, which are the US, Australian, and Korean aid agencies, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The way it works is pretty simple. We aggregate information about innovations in low or middle income countries, as well as funding that's available for them, or funding that has been given to them. So it's really a matter of aggregating all of this information about the innovation ecosystem across the globe focused on low or middle income countries. And the way that we think about accelerating innovation in these economies is really looking at specific stakeholders in this ecosystem and thinking about what are the specific challenges that they face that we can help address. And the way we started is by looking at social entrepreneurs. So we're a social entrepreneur first platform. We believe that they have lived experiences that makes them experts in being able to solve some of the world's toughest challenges in these economies. So we started by looking at, what are some of the biggest challenges they face. And for any of you who have ever dealt with any entrepreneurs or been an entrepreneur yourself, of course, the biggest challenge they face is fundraising. So that's the problem that we aim to solve with the platform, is how can we make information more easily accessible to them? Something as simple as, here are the 10, open calls for innovation that are going on in your country, to years where, X funder has funded in your specific sector, so here's how you can develop your own fundraising strategy. And then, of course, the same information is the foundation of being able to glean insights that are relevant and important in bringing transparency to this entire industry, very much similar to what the private sector does with the startups industry.
Great, thank you very much. Now, what the GII does, of course, is hold up a mirror, or tries to hold up a mirror based on data of what's happening in the world. And one of the disturbing things that we see, of course, is this persistent gap between the high-income countries and the lower middle and low-income countries in innovation performance. It's a massive challenge for the world. And with the acceleration and the speed of technological development, we risk, I think, seeing this gap exacerbated rather than reduced. So there are some, of course, good stories, and we've heard about some of them today. Your view on the innovation divide and how we can tackle this really massive challenge.
Sure. So there are a couple of things, and before I answer that, one of the things that I did want to mention was a couple of the speakers today have mentioned this, which I think is incredibly important, especially in LMICs, is to think about innovation is not technology, is not necessarily just science, it's much more than that. And I wanted to just propose and share a definition by a specific collaboration called the International Development Innovation Alliance, which Results for Development is a secretariat for. It's a collaboration of about 15 or so international development innovation funders. And together they agreed on this definition, which I think is really important to think about in the development context. So I'll read that out. It's specifically in the development from the development perspective, IDEA defines innovation as a new solution with the transformative ability to accelerate impact. So again, impact here is incredibly important, looking at how can we address some of the development challenges. And in terms of innovation, it can be fueled by science and technology, absolutely, but it can also entail improved ways of working with new and diverse partners, or it can involve new social and business models or policies, creative financing mechanisms, or path-breaking improvements in delivering essential services and products. And that's something that I think is really important when we're thinking about LMICs, is that innovation there may not necessarily look exactly like innovation would, say, in Silicon Valley. So since the theme here is energy, one example I wanted to share, so many of you may have heard examples of lots of off-grid energy solutions that exist. When we're looking at just one simple example of, say, a solar-powered lantern, we may all look at that as the innovation. But besides that, there are several other innovations that go into play there. One, for example, could be the supply chain or distribution innovation of actually getting it to the folks who are in the rural areas. Another could be actually making that easily accessible through financing mechanism or payment models to the bottom of the pyramid. So when we think about LMICs, it's I think really important to think about the fact that innovation there looks very, very different. And so there's absolutely a divide, but there's actually a lot of creativity going on there that we can take absolutely look at for inspiration as well.
Exactly, and so very briefly, how do you think the GII does at measuring innovation in the low-income countries, the sorts of grassroots innovations that you're referring to?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, this was the first time that I came across it, and I'm really intrigued by it, and I was looking through all of the methodologies of it. I think it's really inspiring to see leaders like Rwanda on there, and I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about sort of how can we do a better job of also incorporate some of these creativity that's happening that might not necessarily be measured by some of the more traditional IPs, et cetera.
Great. Now I'm going to throw the panelists to the lions. And I open the floor and invite questions of the panelists. Please, the lady here, just here. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and saying who you are, where you're coming from, and then the question.
Thank you. Good morning. No, it's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Onika Stellingberg. I am from the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Guyana to the UN. First up, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having us here. It was a lovely first half. I really enjoyed all of the discussions, especially the opening segments. Introducing the index, I quickly flipped through the list to see if my country was there. I guess we still have a couple of things to do to see how we can improve our innovation in all sectors. As was rightfully mentioned at the end, it's not just technology, but it's, new solutions with a transformative ability to accelerate impact, which is something I definitely will take away from today's session. So I have two questions for the opening speakers, as well as one for Michael. I can't see your surname from here, sorry. Yes. So 11 years of data is quite a lot, and my best friend is a researcher, and hearing about 11 years worth of data, I'm very excited to ask for all of it, to just pour through that to see some of the very fun things that would have captured. So for those countries that are outperforming others, and they're not necessarily some of the larger countries with large GDPs, what would you say has been some of the main drivers of change within those countries, and in what sectors? Very broadly, doesn't have to be very specific.
I'm going to limit you to that for the moment. So one question, we'll get that answered. We'll see if there are other questions, and then we can always come back to you.
No problem, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So who's going to have a shot at this?
So maybe I'll just take a first shot at it, and maybe my colleagues might just add to it. Yes, we have a lot of data, and we are very willing to share it with people. So there are people doing PhD thesis using our data right now, people analyzing the data in different ways. We have also done our own analysis, and what we have found is, of course, the kind of actions that matter depends partially on the income level of the economy. So at lower income levels, what matters a lot in terms of differentiating economies that do better is the ability of institutions to set up institutional frameworks. As mentioned, the ambassador out here in the case of Rwanda, I think that's very important. The ability of the economy to invest in human talent, which is a little obvious, but is very important again. And the ability to be able to invest in business sophistication and business adoption of innovative practices. Of course, the kind of actions vary depending on the income levels. High income economies tend to have slightly different attributes that differentiate them. But this is something that we have researched as part of a program. Happy to share other details with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumitra. Now, I see, first of all, the permanent representative of Morocco, also an old friend, Ambassador Omar Hilal. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Francis. I'm very happy to see you here among us, and thank you for launching this year Global Innovation Index here in New York. I have 3 questions. One is dealing with intellectual property. And we all know that intellectual property is a key factor to innovation. United States is first in patent and intellectual property. But United States is ranked in your index as 6, and UK, for example, which is not first, is ranked 4. Why is this? And if I can turn my question, what's the part or portion of intellectual property in the innovation? That's my first question. The other question is coming back also to UK. UK is ranked 4. Do you think that next year or after next year, UK will remain 4th after the Brexit? Third question and last one. Third and last one is dealing with artificial intelligence. Do you, in your global innovation, include the assessment of social impact of such innovation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omar. So, look, I'm going to, first on the first question. United States, of course, remains in absolute terms a huge generator of innovation. What the index does is relativize everything, scales to enable comparisons. What is the role of intellectual property? Well, I would say that intellectual property is an indispensable but not sufficient condition of a healthy innovation ecosystem. So there are a lot of other factors that come into play, but of course, if you have innovation outputs, they constitute a competitive advantage, and you are going to want to protect that competitive advantage to construct an economic moat around it, and intellectual property enables you to do that. So it does have, I think, an indispensable, but it's not a sufficient role in a healthy innovation ecosystem. Now, Brexit, one word, the 2/3 of the data are pre-2016, 2017, so pre-Brexit. 1/3 is more recent, I think, 2017. And so we haven't seen any impact that there may be of Brexit. I'll leave it to others to comment on what they think, you know, and looking into a crystal ball, the impact of Brexit might be. And the third question, I think, comes to Sasha. You might like to address that, and then I'll look to the panel for inspiration about Brexit.
Yeah, so thank you. And we have the UK in the room, so Andrew, I mean, in case you want to address that question yourself. But on social innovation, so the GII is also in a former laboratory, because we're quite aware that innovation is hard to measure and that we don't do it perfectly quite yet. So there's a few things that we're very keen on, and one is the area of social innovation and trying to get a metric that fits that perspective. And the other is public sector innovation. So there's two areas of thought that we want to incorporate in the GII in the years to come. Of course, our challenge here is that we're looking at 130 countries. Sometimes this data is not even available in a good way for one country, right? And we can experiment with one or two variables in the GII, but you know, I mean, we have to be kind of sure about the data because of the impact it kind of now has, right? But social innovation is definitely on that list of next things to come.
Ambassador Andrew Staines, who is the DPR of the United Kingdom in charge of trade negotiations in Geneva. So, Andy, Brexit.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Director General, and thanks for the question. I'm not sure I have a crystal ball either, so I won't speculate on the ranking next year. What I'll say is, I think from the UK perspective, what we can do and what we are doing is putting into place what we call innovation-friendly policies. So we've got an industrial strategy That includes a commitment to research and development, to bringing up the volume of research and development as a percentage of GDP over the next 7 years. It's about investing in those sectors, those industries of the future. So the ones I think were name-checked earlier, but the sort of from artificial intelligence right the way through to self-driving cars, to really have an industrial strategy, but an industrial strategy that's very much targeted at the 21st century. So one that looks at what are the industries of the future, and how can we, on the supply side, support our companies to engage and to thrive in those sectors. So I'll leave others to comment on the sort of statistics and what have you, but I think from our perspective, what we can do is to focus on those innovation-friendly policies. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. I know the lady here. Does anyone want to dare on Brexit, or you're fine? You're fine. Good. We'll leave it for the authority. The lady here, please.
So my name is Heather Henyon from Mindshift Capital. I'm a venture capital fund based in Dubai, investing in women-led tech companies globally. So I guess just questions on the Global Innovation Index. Generally, just one around private capital. There seems to be a big focus on policies and government-supported initiatives, but what about the ability that venture capital, angel investors, accelerators, the whole ecosystem in terms of supporting new company growth seems to me pretty critical to innovation. And then just number 2 around gender. So what data points are you looking at or gathering that measures the role that women and girls are playing in innovation? In the Middle East, 50% of the entrepreneurs are women, so it's a massive contributing factor to innovation.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a methodology question, Bruno, and then the gender. I think we have done a number of studies on this. Maybe Sasha or our chief economist, Carsten Fink, who is in the room somewhere, could address that. Bruno, you want to start with the first part?
Yes, about venture capital and coming from Dubai, I think the UAE is a perfect example where everybody says, yes, we need more dynamic financing for innovation, but if you don't have a legislation that allows bankruptcy, that deals with a number of elements, it does not happen. For us, this is included in the first pillar, the methodological point of view, ease of doing business, rule of law, etc. It does not mean that we don't go farther in terms of granularity, but this is where it is being handled, and it's clearly an important element. On the gender side, I will let Sasha address it, but just to point at the fact that a number of aspects and research we've done in previous years, as well as this year, shows that diversity contributes to innovation. And diversity includes, in particular, gender diversity.
Great. Sasha or Carsten? Carsten around? I couldn't see him in the room. Sasha, go ahead.
Yeah, just on, I think microfinance, I mean, you mentioned rule of law, but microfinance and also venture capital is part of this market sophistication pillar, so we're well covered. Now, is that data perfect, right? It's certain private data sources. Probably not, but every year, you know, when one report ends, we get back on certain indicators and try to search for new data. So in case you have, you know, good data on VC, we'll take it. On gender, this is a data point that we introduced, in fact, 2 years ago. So it's the share of females among knowledge workers in particular economies, right? And so there's one data point in there. And when we do this sort of thing, it's also, of course, meant to be a political marker, right? Because then we go to countries and we assess the relative performance of these countries in that particular data point. And this always leads to very, you know, fruitful and interesting discussions, right? I mean, Bruno said diversity drives innovation, and that is reflected a little bit in that indicator.
Let me just add one word. In our chief economist's office, they've done studies on specifically the indicator patent applications, patent applicants, and gender. And what we see is not a great picture. It's now roughly 30%, 1/3 of the inventors in international patent applications filed with us, about 250,000 each year, women, and it has gone up from 20% in the period of the last 10 to 15 years. So there's a very positive movement, but obviously, You know, there are more women than 1/3 in the world of the total population. So we've got a long way to go to see this really improve. And of course, the patent application is coming as a consequence of a lot of other things earlier on, like STEM education, participation and so forth. Please, the gentleman down here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Murad Akdeniz. I'm one of the earlier graduates of Cornell Tech, and I run a blockchain startup based out here in New York City. My question is, both as an immigrant and also the founder of a blockchain startup, how do you see the U.S.'s stance on innovation and kind of running the frontier on innovation possibly eroding over the next few years? Dean Sumitra Dutra kind of mentioned that China's taking over the U.S., and as the founder of a blockchain startup, it's incredibly hard to do a lot of our stuff here in the U.S., and also the anti-immigrant policies here, as we know, both companies like Google have been founded by immigrants. So how do you see kind of the U.S. either continuing forward or possibly not competing with other countries when it comes to that? And also, the UK has great sandbox environments for companies like fintech companies, the US doesn't. And a lot of these kind of contribute to the factor where US might be in the future when it comes to innovation.
Great. Let's turn to the panel. Rima, you a taker? Good.
I'll start.
Yep.
So I would say let's just let's look at. I'm not going to discuss specifically administrations or policies. I think I would very much believe that the U.S. and what we will be continuing to focus on in innovation is going to be extremely crucial. If we look at the focus right now on ensuring that we maintain leadership, specifically as it relates to 5G and telecommunications, and the focus that we have across the country to make sure we do that, I think that's going to be crucial. If we look at the majority of the interactions, they are based on technology, they are based on innovation, and I think that comes clearly through in the index as well. So I think it is the responsibility of every country and every government to focus on innovation and to focus on technology, and I think that focus is there if you strip away the politics, and I think that focus will continue. As it relates to, just to give you some examples of the types of things that we are trying to do, and if I may, I want to pick up on the previous point on STEM as well. I think it is important that we step back and we not only measure what exactly is being done, whether it be gender diversity or other things, only just to measure it. I think it's also the actions that we have to take. And I'd like to just raise one example of what we're doing with schools, with Verizon Foundation. So STEM and STEM education for girls is extremely close for me and personal. I have 2 daughters. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that we reach back into the schools that are less fortunate within the US, and we are actually providing them technology, allowing them with iPads, with phones, to bridge the digital divide and really become part of the environment and part of the technology movement. And I think it is our responsibility to make sure in all of our ways that we do that. It isn't enough to measure, it's also to reach back and make sure that we get enough women, enough girls, and enough people on both sides to really focus on being part of the economy.
Great, thank you. Valentine, please.
Thank you very much for raising this point. Really, it's about the policy. It's about the policy we put in place to increase the number of girls that are really being enrolled in STEM. And let me mention that on the African continent, we have every year the Smart Africa Summit that is taking place. It's held in Rwanda every year, sometime in the first week or second week of May. It really brings all the digital innovation companies in Rwanda, but also regulators, policymakers. And one of the initiatives that has come out of that, it's really to have the girl JIC, and making sure that policies, but also adequate investment are put in place to encourage girls to to really enroll in STEM. In addition to that, it just not only enroll in STEM, but on the output side, provide some incentives to make sure that they innovate and provide solutions that provide real solutions to the challenges in their communities. And I have to say that we have been experiencing that for the last 2 to 3 years, and it is very successful. It is very successful, it is very promising. So once girls are provided with the opportunity, but also the resources needed, well, and the capabilities and the knowledge, we're seeing that they are really, the take-up in terms of technology is quite impressive. While I still have the mic, I think I would like also some of the you know, just Sasha, but also Sumatra to comment also a little bit, and Bruno, to comment a little bit on the SDGs. How do you, what is the place that you give to the Sustainable Development Goals, that you give to really innovation in the Sustainable Development Goal? We're speaking of energy here today. Well, the Sustainable Development Goal that is related to energy, it's incredibly ambitious. That is the goal number 7. It calls for reliable, affordable, sustainable, modern energy access to all. Now, you can't, we know the level of reliability, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability of the energy that we use today. So what is the place? Where do you put the SDGs in this? Thank you.
Just before that, Michael, you have a comment.
Yeah, I just want to come back to Murat here. So Murat talked about the US and policy and all that kind of stuff, but he also made one important point, and that is, I am a startup company. So I think there's something to be explored here for a moment. So we talk about innovation a lot, but when you look at some of the data points out there, so 80% of small businesses fail within the first 10 years, 40% of new business ideas that are brilliantly funded, to our earlier conversation on VC, fail anyway because there is a path to scale missing. So I think that is something for us to explore a bit. So in innovation, you kind of need an idea, you need creativity, so chaos on one hand, but you need order on the other hand, an orderly path to scale. So how do we get that going across an economy? You need policy, that's for sure, but I think you need the willingness in the private sector to start to collaborate and engage in partnerships that are outside of your existing business model. There's a couple of examples of what we do. So recently, we've struck a lot of partnerships with cities, mayors' offices, then with the public transport system, then with a lot of startups that develop solutions, app solutions for public transport, etc. That's the most unusual combination of players coming together, but it is exactly the path to scale. Here's a policymaker, here's somebody who has scale and customers, which is the public transport system, and there's a network like us connecting all of that. And I think those are the kind of models that we will need to look for as you do your cluster research in future indices. I think that's something to look out for, because there is where I think huge value to be unlocked. Now, I've had a conversation with somebody who is a competitor of yours, a blockchain company based out of London, and they said when I approached that idea, they said, I don't want to be incubated, I don't want to be bought, I don't want to be part of your thing. But then we had a beer, and in the end he said, well, you're my path to scale. That's fantastic. So there's skepticism on the private sector as well as in the startup community, and I think if we unlock that, there's a lot of value to be found.
Barry, one question, one quick SDG comment. Barry, please.
Yeah, one thing I just was going to add on that question of the impact on the U.S. and countries given immigration restrictions. And in the fall, in October, PwC Strategy, and we released a report, actually I think there were copies at the desk, called Will Stronger Borders Weaken Innovation? And we surveyed about 1,000 R&D and CTOs, as well as quite a few deans of technical schools around the country. And the few things I would share out of that, one is that the 3 most at-risk countries to having their innovation environment degraded were number 1, the United States, number 2, China, and number 3, Britain, if economic nationalism really came to have teeth and to stick. For the US, it was basically interrupting the access to talent. And I know we informally surveyed quite a few deans of, both first-tier and second-tier technical universities in the United States. The first tier, we're all good. I mean, people want to go to MIT, they want to go to Stanford, no matter how hostile the environment may be. The second-tier universities, we're seeing 15 to 20% drops in applications for engineering and science programs, particularly at the graduate level. And you have to remember, in the United States, 81% of computer science PhDs and master's degrees are foreign-born students. Almost every graduate program, biochemistry, chemical engineering, physics, astrophysics, the master's and PhD candidates are not US citizens. So the US was vulnerable by interrupting the access to senior technical talent because people don't want to go to a hostile environment. Very understandable. China, the at-risk for China was around that the largest source of corporate R&D funding is non-Chinese corporations. It's European, American, and Japanese companies setting up R&D facilities in China. And if there was a massive trade war, you could see people deciding, I can't put that engineering center there. So China was the #2 vulnerability around interrupting the flow of corporate R&D funding from non-Chinese companies. Third most at risk, Brexit. Combination of the same thing with the US, interrupting the flow of talent, of graduate students coming from the continent and going to school, Cambridge, Oxford, other leading universities in Britain. Secondarily, that because of potential interrupting the ease of travel, people would not want to set up new R&D facilities or increase capacity in the UK, and they would do it somewhere on the continent instead. So those were the 3 big vulnerabilities. I think it all kind of makes sense. But I think the thing that is, to me, was the most disturbing is the rapid decrease in applications for the second tier, the San Diego states, good technical universities that don't have the prestige, global prestige value, that are already seeing double-digit drops in foreign applications because of the environment.
Great, thank you very much. Now, a quick comment, if I may, on the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll have one last question. We have to close down. I'm going over time. Look, the way we at WIPO see it, and as a matter of fact, my special representative for the SDGs is across the river in the UN explaining right at the moment introducing the GII. So innovation, of course, is part of Sustainable Development Goal number 9, innovation itself. And we see innovation as an enabler for improvement in every SDG. So it's an enabler for improvement, as you have mentioned, Valentine, in energy. It's an enabler for improvement in health, good health. It's an enabler for improvement in education. There is innovation right across the board. So we feel it is a horizontal contribution to the improvement of performance in respect of all SDGs. May I turn for the last final question to the audience? The lady here, please, yes.
Hi. Actually, Michael, this question is for you. I totally believe in what you said in terms of, startups. Obviously, they are great in creating the new idea and seeing the niches in the market, but then when it's come to scaling, it's a difficult job. And of course, companies like Verizons and MasterCards of this world are great at that. And I've been recently in another conference, a FinTech, Future of FinTech conference, where actually one of the companies you acquired or merged with, Avid Exchange, made some points about how it took 18 months to integrate with MasterCard. Initially, they started off with a 6-month idea, but it turned into an 18-month journey. But they were also mentioning how much they appreciated the type of detail and standards they wouldn't have imagined. But the thing is, what are you doing to, make this really into a 6-month or a 3-month journey so that we can have many more innovators really happy to be working with the big corporations to scale and diversify and democratize their innovation into the whole world rather than staying small.
I could have not wished for a better question. And this was not planted. No, seriously. So first of all, on this 6 to 18 months, so what is part of the reason why scale is difficult? You need to have something that works in more than one place, and it needs to work for a range of applications and customers and so forth. So you got to force fit whatever a startup is thinking that works in a particular context into a much broader context. So you got to adjust that. So that's a starting point. But then you say, all right, you still don't have the time because there is, the speed of change is happening in a way that nobody has 18 months to waste. So what do you got to do? Companies like ours, like banks, like whatever, the capital market infrastructure is all operating on legacy technology. So the big task that we have at hand, certainly in our company, and there might be others in the telecom industry or wherever, is really to undo that monolithic IT infrastructure and make it more into a plug-and-play kind of version. And then there's a mindset change required as well. If I want to partner with Murat and say, that's lovely, your stuff, I want to integrate it into my business model, that is one way, but it is most likely going to lead exactly to such delays. The other option is to say, well, why don't you innovate with me and you use my infrastructure and you just plug yourself in and you just keep doing what you're doing. And I think that is a very promising model. So today, MasterCard is a network, and we are opening our network for other people's innovation because we realize we don't have all of the answers. So let's make use of the ecosystem out there and the startups and everybody, and we address exactly that problem. By the way, we're on a good path with Avid.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Sumitra, but first let me thank our fantastic panel. Thank you so much.